Good evening, everyone. It's always so lovely to be back at Luck. It's always hard to believe that it's been almost 2 years in your absence. For those of you who I haven't met before, I'm Ella. I am a ex-eplet, and since I have moved from Leichhardt Uniting, I've been serving as the youth pastor at Glenbrook Uniting Church in the Lower Blue Mountains. And the other important thing that you need to know about me if we haven't met before is that I am, to quote directly from Radhika Sukumar White, geeky about the Bible. But luckily, this comes in handy in my job because I am across all of the Bible stories that teenage boys love, all the really gross ones. And much like my own Year 10 boys at youth group, as a kid, I was obsessed with making my dad tell me all the Bible stories that didn't make it into Sunday school. If there was a story that involved poo, foreskins, a gory murder, I really wanted to hear about it. And being a wee little proto-feminist in a pretty conservative church, there was nothing I loved more than a girl boss stabbing a general through the head with a tent peg. Biblical womanhood, baby! I loved this story of Deborah and Jael because it was a rare chance for women to do the things that men were always being praised for. Leading, being brave, conquering enemies, and winning fights. It began to seed the first questions I ever had about the place of women in the church. Why were women allowed to be judges, but not ministers? Why could they direct an army and kill a general, but not preach a sermon or preside over communion? I'm grateful for judges and for Deborah and Jael for planting those first seeds that maybe women had something more to offer the church than submission and support. I love that the description of Deborah that is often translated wife of Lapidoth, translated directly actually means woman of fire. I'm grateful for Deborah and for Jael and a long lineage of fiery women who have blessed me and countless others with their courage and leadership. But to be honest, I struggle to read this passage with the same excitement as I did when I was a little kid in Sunday school. Stories about foreskin sacrifices or gory assassinations or prophets killing teens via bears make for an awesome Game of Thrones knockoff. But I'm increasingly ill at ease when I find them in my sacred text. I find myself asking, is war somehow a good thing when a woman directs it? What are we missing when we see Deborah and Jael merely as proof texts in our own 21st century debate? Has this story got something more to tell us than just the capacity of women to be murderers? Has it got something to tell us about the character of a God who liberates? Part of my disenchantment with this supposedly girl boss story came as I began to understand its place in the Hebrew Scriptures, and specifically its place in the book of Judges. A lot of my gory childhood favorites come from Judges. Not only was there the creative use of tent pegs, but also kings who pooed themselves to death and divine hairstyles that gave you supernatural strength. But Judges isn't an action movie. It's a tragedy. It contains some of the most horrifying, violent, and disturbing stories in our Bible. The book of Judges comes directly after Joshua, when the Israelites come into the already occupied Promised Land, and it comes before the establishment of Israel's monarchy in 1 and 2 Samuel. It's a violent and disturbing book that follows Israel's descent into complete moral corruption and idolatry, as they forget the ways of the God who liberated them from slavery in Egypt. The book follows a series of cycles in a kind of downward spiral. Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord, so God turns them over to be oppressed by their enemies. The Israelites cry out and beg God to deliver them. God hears them, raises up a judge, delivers the Israelites, and brings a time of peace. But then, in 40 years or so, God's people forget all over again, and the cycle continues. The judges start off pretty good, like Deborah, but with each subsequent judge, both the judge and the people are more and more nightmarish, till at the end of Judges, Israel has regressed to a state of violence and evil so despicable they are completely unrecognizable as the people of God. Again and again, Israel does what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. Judges isn't really Sunday school material at all. Even our story today is disturbing. War and murder and a conquered land that is already inhabited. It's not a history lesson or an action movie. The characters in Judges are not really people to learn from at all. Judges is a waking nightmare of the horrific cycles of violence and sin that human beings are capable of when we forget that Yahweh is the God who liberates. The cycles of violence in Judges weren't new. In fact, we can see each cycle as a mini reenactment of the Exodus story, that founding narrative of God's people. There's evil and oppression and a calling out to God for deliverance. God raises up Moses and delivers the Israelites from slavery. But after a brief fling with the idea of following God's law, God's people are back to erecting golden calves and forgetting all about their God of deliverance. Ever since that founding story of rescue and of liberation, God's people have been forgetting what it means to be free. Forgetting what they've been freed for. Forgetting what it means to be made in the image of a liberating God. The cycle of violence in Judges might not have been new, but it certainly isn't old either. Friends, I don't know about you, but when I look around, I see a world trapped in the same downward spiral. I see again and again image bearers doing what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. I see people who have known oppression turn around to grind the jackboot down on someone else. I hear words that were supposed to be good news used as weapons. I see a genocide in Gaza and violence in the lands now called Australia and the victimizing of women that hasn't stopped since the 8th century BC. I see violence and corruption and sinful injustice of Judges-like proportions. And what is maybe harder to face and to say out loud is that I see those cycles of violence in my own soul. The same cynicisms, the same exhaustions, the same moral shortcuts, the same vices written off as not a big deal, the same chances for reconciliation that I brush off again and again. Again and again, I do what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. At the beginning of this week, I was preparing to write this sermon, to get into a pulpit and tell you all about a God who liberates. And I was on the train on my way into Central, and a man came into my carriage on the train. He was clearly experiencing homelessness. He wasn't wearing shoes. He looked like he was having a pretty rough time. And he began to kind of address the carriage kind of at large, asking for help. That he had come to Sydney after being hospitalised with a manic episode, that he was trying to get back home to country, that he needed help, a hot meal, maybe some money towards a ticket. And when he'd finished talking, he took off his hat and he walked down the aisle asking for money. And I don't really want to make eye contact with him and I said, sorry, I don't have any cash on me. And I got off the train, and I realized you couldn't have had a better opportunity on a silver platter to practice the stuff that we talk about every week. This is the stuff that I get into a pulpit and tell all of you, the stuff in our liturgies and our songs, that Christ had come to me in a stranger, and I said, sorry, I didn't have any cash on me. I didn't have anywhere to be, I wasn't rushing, and I could have helped, and I didn't. And that weighed on me. That I had the chance to image a liberating God, and I didn't. And so I got off the train, and I walked out of Central Station, and I walked into a church that's nearby to go and poke around, and I sat down in the pew, and I looked at above the altar, there was a crucifix. And I burst into tears. Because on the wall was my liberating God, who my whole life is supposed to revolve around. And when he came to me in a stranger, I said, sorry, I can't help. And we stayed for the evening prayer at this church. And in the liturgy, we repeat, Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. I couldn't believe that as callously and as easily as I had failed to give liberation to someone else, I walked into a church, and for some insane and unknowable reason, God's mercy was on the table for me. Again, and again, and again. And his liberation was still there for me, even when I failed to offer it to someone else. Friends, are you tired? Are you tired of knowing that you are made good and beautiful in the image of a good and beautiful God, and yet caught in the same cycles of sin and hurt and of shame? Are you weary of those loops of shame that crave forgiveness but settle for distraction? Are you exhausted by looking at a world that is formed by and for love, and yet is caught in the most base reenactments of evil over and over again? To read Judges, to read this story of Deborah and Jael, is to realize something that we know by walking from the train station or from reading the news. There is something terribly, catastrophically wrong. Catholic priest Monsignor James Shea says, there is a dark veil that hangs over the human race. There's a tragedy that runs through all human life that touches upon the indescribable. In my work as a youth pastor, there is one point that I never have to labor with my teenagers. One detail that they never need to clarify or have proven to them. Something is drastically, horribly wrong. And for all our efforts, for all our great projects of usefulness and beauty, for all our ravenous curiosity and our powerful desire for something greater, we cannot fix it. Something is fundamentally not as it should be in our world and within our own souls. But what if that great wrongness could be dealt with? What if those chains of injustice could be broken, not just situationally, but cosmically? What if that great and shadowy fracture that runs through our communities and our histories and our politics and our relationships and our own selves was not destined to keep cycling and cycling down into the cosmic sinkhole, but was in fact a pitiful attempt on borrowed time. We have something much better than a military leader, a judge, or a king. We have a savior. We have a liberator. We have Jesus, God who became man to set us free from the tyranny of sin and death, who has led us out of slavery, who leads us out still, who has put death itself to death, who tends to our wounds, who brings down those in high places and raises up the oppressed, who could be found standing with every victim in the book of Judges and every woman who has known abuse and every child in Gaza. This liberating God who became human so that we might become like our God who liberates. See, in Deborah and Jael, we have much more than proof texts about the role of women. We have examples of people who, caught up as they are in the cycles of violence, have given their yes to God's plans of liberation, who have become deliverers in emulation of the one who is our ultimate deliverer. Each one of us receives this gift, this free and total liberation from every power that would bind us, this promise of total forgiveness and of total justice. There is nothing we can do that would stop Yahweh from delivering us again and again and again. And there is no greater power than Christ, the breaker of chains and the victor over death. There is only this gift, this freely given gift of his life and of his death and his resurrection. And then there is only invitation to become like the one who has trampled down death, who has led us out of slavery, who is reconciling all things. Will we be like him? Will we be the liberated, liberating people of God? Amen.